you for coming. Welcome to today's science pop-up lecture. My name is Paula Cushing. I'm curator of invertebrate zoology at the museum. And it's my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Garth Spellman. Garth started here in 2015. He is our curator of ornithology, and his research focuses on how recent and ancient environmental changes have affected bird species. Birds are products of their environment and therefore are constantly evolving in response to environmental change. And Garth uses all sorts of techniques, as do all of us in zoology, to look at these patterns and processes of evolution that involve birds. Although I don't do birds, but he does birds. So today he's going to be speaking about the rise and fall of Colorado's Rosy Finch. So without further ado, please welcome Garth Spellman.
Thank you, Paula. And thank you everyone for coming today. And she does, in a way study birds, because a lot of what she studies actually feed birds. So that's okay. They like to eat those things. I'm going to tell you today a story about a bird that I've been working on since I got to Colorado. I wanted to start a project working on sort of, iconic Coloradan birds. And before we get to that bird, though, we've got to talk about sort of the fate of birds right now and what is happening to birds globally and what's happening to birds locally, because that puts in context why we want to study these species and how environmental change is affecting them. And so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about how climate change is affecting birds from a general perspective. And so if we look globally across the globe, birds are in trouble. About 48% of birds are experiencing severe declines in their numbers. This is not a shock to most zoologists that work in any group, because this is actually happening across the board in biodiversity around the world. Birds, however, are pretty easy to observe. Most are diurnal, they're out there all the time, and they're easy to study. So these declines in many other species are estimates, whereas birds, many of the declines that we're seeing, extreme declines, have been directly measured. So within North America, we've seen a decline of 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. So that is sheer population numbers. That's not species, of course, being lost, because in North America, we only have about 900 species of birds. This is the number in populations. So you can imagine your favorite bird, whether it be a white-breasted nuthatch or an American robin, right? So we have lost, in many instances, 40 to 60% of the populations of those species. And it is happening across all biomes. We see dramatic reductions across the board. So forest birds, tundra birds, and of course, so in our state, grassland birds, because we have more grasslands than we do other area within Colorado. And we see huge reductions in grassland birds. This estimate was published about 4 or 5 years ago now, and our losses are now at around 60% of all grassland birds, with many species experiencing 70 to 90% loss. And we know in many instances what the factors are that are contributing to these losses. The number 2 causes in birds loss are biological resource use. So think things like deforestation when you think about biological resource use. Number 2, agriculture. So especially for grassland birds, because where do we grow food? Mostly where grasslands occur. And so we remove those grasslands and we put up monocultures, and that's not good for the species that occur there. Now, the number 3 leading cause is estimated to be climate change and extreme weather, right? But if you look at that gray bar on this third bar, this gray portion, suggests that we do not know how climate change and extreme weather are impacting birds. So we are suggesting, we're hypothesizing that that's the case, but we don't have many good examples, and we haven't studied it very well. And so that's why I'm going to talk to you about the Rosy Finch, because it's one species that we're beginning to learn a lot about, and we're trying to figure out how climate change has affected the species over the recent evolutionary past, and how it will affect the species in future under certain climate change scenarios. And so that brings us to what we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the origin of this species and how climate change led to its origin. And I'm going to talk about how climate change is affecting the species and could lead to its decline or demise. So this is our character. This is a brown-capped rosy finch right here. So brown-capped rosy finch are chionophiles. They are organisms that thrive in cold, wintry conditions. And this is a species that occurs in Colorado. It breeds almost exclusively above 12,000 feet. And so it's pretty much restricted to the state of Colorado, gets a little bit into southern Wyoming. It used to breed in northern New Mexico, but those populations have been extirpated, which means they're just no longer there. So the species is still around, but those local populations are now extinct in northern Mexico. And so they forage on snowfields, and they breed in that alpine tundra. And so we do know that alpine tundra is at extreme risk for climate change. High latitude, high altitude environments are experiencing more rapid change than other areas. And so we wanted to look at brown-capped rosy finches. And so a large group of researchers and I got together to try and address a number of questions. First, we want to find out whether or not the brown-capped rosy finch is a distinct species, because lots of researchers have studied the species before, and no one's ever been able to identify unique genetic, right, code that actually defines this species. So it's been identified as genetically similar to its sister species. And so we wanted to look and see whether or not we can call it a distinct species. And then we're going to talk about how their habitats are connected. So we call them sky islands. If you think about sea level being at about 10,000 feet, so higher than what it is right now, it creates islands in the sky and where their habitats and where they breed are. And then we wanted to ask, is the species at risk of decline environmentally and genetically? And then we're looking now at whether or not rosy finch diets have shifted in response to change in their environment, and whether or not populations are experiencing stress, more stress now than in the past. Today I'm going to talk about the first three of those questions and show you how we study that. So rosy finch species are a complex. So there are 4 species in the complex. There's an Asian rosy finch, which is in red right there, or in orange. That's the Asian rosy finch. And then after you get into the Bering Sea, after the Kamchatka Peninsula out here, you get different subspecies of gray-crowned rosy finch, this individual right here, that are out on the Aleutian Islands, the Pribilof Islands, through continental Alaska, and the gray crowns get down into the continental contiguous United States through Canada, and then into the Sierra Nevada mountains on the west coast. So the black rosy finch you find in this blob actually is on high elevation throughout the southern Rocky Mountains in Utah and the northern Rocky Mountains. And then our brown-capped rosy finch is this one that's found down in this red splotch down there. So this is a species complex of 4 species with multiple subspecies between them. Now, the nice thing about studying something at high elevation is you get to go to beautiful areas. So this is another shot of the Snowy Range in southern Wyoming. And I've had the privilege of bringing teen science scholars out to do this work back before the pandemic. And so I brought a group out to study birds in the Snowy Range, and we're going to show you how we do it. So when we first went out, we thought, all right, these birds like to eat bugs off of snowfields. And so you find a snowfield, you might be able to set up a mist net in that environment to catch them. Those are those fine mesh nets that you use to capture birds. This didn't work out very well for us. So you can see in this environment, they're very easy to see. And the wind blows pretty strong when you're up in the mountains. I was still happy though. And so you can see how our nets are billowing in the wind. This wasn't very good, and when the sun shines directly on them, we had brown-capped Rosy Finches that eventually perched on top of our nets. So it wasn't very effective at capturing them. We did capture a few things when we first started out. That's a violet-green swallow. It's another species that breeds at high elevation, but they also occur down at lower elevations, and they nest in the rocky crevices up here. But we had to shift gears, and we used these things that are called potter traps in order to catch brown-capped Rosy Finches in these environments. And so what we do is you go up to high elevation, you bait an area with black oilseed sunflowers, and eventually brown-capped Rosy Finches find that baited area where the seed is spread out, and they'll start to forage and feed in those areas. As soon as that occurs, you can introduce these traps into that area where you've been baiting. And so they have little doors on either end and a little lever right here. And what happens, you prop that door up, and when they stand on a little platform, when they come in to get the seed, the door just closes right behind them. They're very easy to capture once you've baited them. They go into the traps all the time. And once you've caught one and you've handled it and you've measured it and you've done what you're going to do with it, they go right back into the trap. They just want the seed. So they're very easy to catch. You kind of have to shoo the ones away that you've already studied, because once you get one or two individuals in a trap, then you're done. So there are problems when you're trapping on snowfields. You can see this rock came loose up here and somehow managed to come right down and hit our traps. We were fortunate we didn't lose any Rosy Finches, so there were none in the traps at the time, but still, it's not without its problems. Other areas are not so easy to catch. So this is on Pikes Peak. In this case, our Rosy Finches, they are nesting in these cliff faces. Pikes Peak in the summer is essentially devoid of snowfields, and so the Rosy Finches are harder to capture. We had to use ropes, and we put traps down in these areas on these slopes in order to catch them. And so you can see this is Joel, who's down there. The trap is right here, and the ropes were on the other side of the rocks. And so it's not so easy to get down there. But once we get them in the little bags, record data. My kids come along and eat snacks the entire time. So that's fun for them. And then when we get them, we band them. So this is the unique USGS band. And then this was a color band that I'll talk about a little bit later that we attach to the birds on certain peaks as well. So you get them, you measure their wings, measure their legs, take a weight on them, you record their age and their sex, and all this can be done morphologically, especially during the breeding season. So males will have a cloacal protuberance that kind of sticks out on the bottom down where their cloaca is, and females don't have that. And so you can sex them, and then you can age them based on skull ossification, so how ossified their skull is. Birds have transparent skin, so you can just blow on their feathers on their head, look through, and see whether or not it's fully ossified or not. So you can age a bird as well. And then we take a little tiny hypodermic needle, and we get the feathers on their arm or on their wing, right, to the side, and wet it down a little bit, and we puncture their brachial vein, and we take blood for genetic work. And so once we've got all this, that's when we have to get back to the lab and start analyzing data. So the first thing we wanted to do was find out whether or not brown-capped rosy finches are a distinct species. And so we take that blood sample, and what we've done is we've sequenced the whole genome of 68 rosy finches. So that's 14 brown-capped rosy finches, and then an assortment from the other species and subspecies that we saw from across the globe. And so we sequence all of their DNA. And so what is genomics, and why do we use it? Well, genomics is the study of all the DNA within an animal or an organism. So up here, this is a karyotype of a human, and bird genomes are very different. This is the karyotype of a zebra finch right here, and most bird genomes look like this. Bird genomes average about 1.1 to 1.3 billion billion base pairs. How many in a human, does anyone know? So I see someone's holding up 3. Yeah, 3 billion. So birds are about 1/3 the size of a human. Their genomes are very different. You've got macrochromosomes like we have within ours, but the majority of their genome is found in these little tiny chromosomes that we call microchromosomes. And then they also have sex-linked genes, or sex chromosomes like we do, but theirs is different. So in birds, we call it ZW because the females are the heterochromatic sex. So in humans or in mammals, the males are, right? Males are XY. In birds, the females are ZW. So they have a different one. So it's a little different. But we can use all the information that's in a genome to ask questions about those birds. So who here has ever done 23andMe or any other DNA, right, ancestry kit? Is anyone? Okay. And you got a report back. And it told you what? Where you were from, right? Kind of what your ancestry was. Well, that's because the evolutionary history, right, of you and your ancestors is written into that genome. And if you know how to read it, you can infer the history of that species. And so that's why we are sequencing DNA, is because we can figure out how to read the genome, and it can tell us a lot about the evolutionary history of the species. I don't know who Ann Weiler is. I found this online. But she's obviously Northern European. So we can do the same thing with birds. It tells us a lot about their history. And so that's what we do. So these services, however, they only look at about 600,000, right, SNPs across the genome. In the birds we're looking at, we get the entire genome. So that helps us look at their history. And so we do that, and we build things like evolutionary trees. And this allows us to make inferences about those species. So in rosy finches, our brown-capped rosy finch is this last branch right down here with this bluish purple bar right next to it. Now, no study before we had looked at whole genomes was able to determine that brown-capped rosy finches were a genetically distinct and unique species. We were finally able to do that with genomes. But what we find as well is genes have moved across the tree. So these arrows reflect what we call gene flow. It means genes that are moving from one branch of an evolutionary tree to another. You can think of birds moving across a landscape and interbreeding. So if a bird from Alaska were to breed with a bird from Canada, that's what you get, is movement of genes across there. But from this, we're actually able to conclude that rosy finches diverged in the last glacial maximum, so when ice covered most of North America, and they did so with gene flow, and that was important. So you have to go back to the last glacial maximum and think, well, where were rosy finches during this time? Most of the continent, including all high elevation locations in the Rocky Mountains, were covered in ice. So habitat, rosy finch habitat, was essentially under a mile of ice. And so our data suggests that rosy finches actually occurred during that time primarily in Asia, as the Asian rosy finch, and within a region called Beringia, because at this time there was a land bridge between Asia and North America. And the rosy finches occurred out on islands that were not iced over, and then also within Beringia in this landmass that would have been available to them in the high latitude across Asia and North America. And it wasn't until ice started receding that the species started to colonize and differentiate in North America. And so our brown-capped rosy finch is a very young species. We believe that it only arose within the last 15,000 years, and it has maintained its unique character since then. And so we've published 2 studies on this, and in the first we show that climate change since the last glacial maximum was critical to the evolution of brown creepers. So climate change is important to the origin of the species. And the species has rapidly adapted to high elevation. We've identified the genes that have allowed it to adapt to high elevation, and we've also identified the genes that are responsible for a lack of gray on its head in a recent species, or a recent paper. And we also show that migration is very important to the survival of the species over that time. Now, we've started to look at other things. And now that we know that brown-capped rosy finches are distinct, we want to figure out, well, how connected are they? Because connectivity in a species is important, right? It's important that you don't have peripheral populations that are inbreeding and losing genetic diversity, because those populations then are at risk of any disturbances, so in their environment, and could go locally extinct. So how connected are those populations? Well, that's where we got to those color bands. The first thing we wanted to do, we color banded all these birds on their breeding grounds with a color band on their right leg. And we were hoping that birders, since there's a lot of birders out there, might go out and see rosy finches on the wintering grounds and the breeding grounds with color bands and report that in their bird sightings. So we went out on mountain ranges and we banded over 3,000 rosy finches, so at high elevation. And we banded over 3,000 on the wintering grounds when they would come down during storms in the winter. We only got 5 sightings reported. We also had over 100 sightings reported of a bird that had a band on its right leg, so where the color had been scraped off, because they live in such an extreme environment where they're on the rocks all the time. They were scraping those metal colored bands on rocks, and so they just look silver. So everyone would look silver. So color banding didn't help us determine how connected populations were. So we had to turn once again to genomics. And so we took blood samples from 140 rosy finches from multiple populations across Colorado, and we can look at their genetic diversity and summarize it in plots that look like this. And in this case, when you see dots moving off to the side, that's explaining genetic variation. And those birds are different than anything that's found within this cluster over here. And so we can see, in this case, Pike's peak birds are coming off as being genetically different from others. We also see the snowy range in southern Wyoming as coming out and being different. and then Devil's Causeway, which is in the Flat Top Mountains and the lowest elevation mountain within our sample. And so what this shows is that populations that have high elevation connections between them are maintained connectivity, and those peripheral populations that are out on the edges of the distribution are beginning to show genetic distinction. And we believe that that is because of inbreeding within those local populations. And so our peripheral populations show differentiation, whereas those that are in the heart of the Rocky Mountains don't. So if you have high elevation connecting you, healthy population variation, on the periphery you start to lose genetic variation. So then we started to ask, well, how will these birds react to future climate change? And this is complicated, but we use genomics again, and we look at ecological data and climate data as well. And what we're trying to ask here is, in the future, will birds be able to exist in their current locations, or will they have to adapt within that location, move to another location that has suitable habitat, or is there a potential for those populations to die off? And so in order to do this, we use genomics coupled with climate modeling and ecological niche modeling, so looking at the ecology of these birds within their habitat. And then we use, it's a scary word right now, but artificial intelligence to sort through the genomic data, the ecological data, and the climate data to tell us how locally adapted populations are to their current environments and whether or not future environments have the capacity to support those birds in the condition that they're in right now. And if we do that, what we see is actually on the bottom here. So this is our climate projection, or our projection of adaptive variation appropriate for future climates in Rosy Finches. So this is a paper that was published last year in Diversity and Distributions. So this is their current range, right there. These tiny little purple blobs right there identify populations that have adaptive genetic variation that will match future conditions. And so that is essentially two tiny little blips on the map. Now, those birds, it's not something that should be totally scary, because that just means we do have adaptive variation that is a fit for future environments. What needs to happen is the genes or the individuals that have them within those locations need to move and migrate out to spread that adaptive variation that will be a fit for future environments. So we need to make sure that we provide adequate space for those birds to move in the future in order to spread that adaptive variation. So what does it all mean in the end? Well, our Rosy Finch, is a hardy little bird. We should be very proud of this thing. It has adapted and diverged from close relatives within the last 15 years. It has maintained its genetic uniqueness, even in the face of migration of genes from other populations. But it's important to remember that climate change was essential in the origin of this species. The species has shown remarkable adaptive potential. Our current populations still maintain a lot of connectivity, and we hope that continues in the future. But we do have concerns. Our models indicate that future suitable habitat is only a fraction of what we have today, and only 2 areas show the appropriate genetic variation to future conditions. And so the potential for extreme population decline is very high within this species. And I think it's one that is ripe for conservation, because we have shown with bird conservation that if you have focused efforts, conservation works in birds. And so to know this now and be preemptive about it, I think gives us a leg up. So this kind of work requires lots of collaboration. So lots of people I want to thank in institutions and museums. And I would love to take questions about this from anyone. I think, where do they turn it on in the back?
I don't know.
Oh, beautiful.
I just wanted to throw the cue, so please tell me somebody has questions. Oh, fantastic.
Hi, Garth. Nice talk. Do the blue bands on the legs, are they a maladaptive trait? I mean, could the low number of sightings be affected by predators who can see them or other effects?
So banding they've looked at it and it hasn't had a huge impact on populations that are banded. You can't necessarily say that in a new species. So nobody's ever banded brown-capped Rosy Finches before. We don't think so. And we don't think so because there were a lot of sightings of birds with the bands. They'd just been scraped. The paint had been scraped off. So on average, when you band a bird, the recapture rate for a banded bird and even the resighting rate is below 1%. So it's not surprising that we got that. And I think in order to really get those resightings, we would have to band several more than just the 6,000 that we had done. So.
Thank you. You talked earlier about the birds in general seem to have a pretty large decline and it seems pretty consistent. Are there any species right now that we know are thriving and actually growing in the midst of the climate change and the shifts?
I'll give you one guess, and all you have to do is look outside at City Park. So waterfowl. But waterfowl, if you go back in history, in the early 1900s, waterfowl were in extreme peril. So, a lot of our watersheds have been drained and and there was a focused conservation effort driven mainly by hunters. So if you think about Ducks Unlimited and these other private and public partnerships, that really led to an increase in waterfowl and a promotion of how to improve the health of your wetlands and promote wetland habitats. And so those species have really rebounded from that low point. And now their populations are estimated to be greater than what they were probably even before that hunting pressure was put on them. And so, like I said before, our focused conservation efforts do work, and especially within birds, we see that. Another great example are bald eagles and peregrine falcons. So we have a lot of success stories in bird conservation, but this is on a much more massive scale, is what we're thinking. Yeah.
So you used AI in this study to connect the genetic information and the niche models. Is there any way to go back and check the thought train that your AI took in order to reach its conclusions, or is that pretty obscure and tough to reproduce?
That is very tough to reproduce. And so what we do is we use 3 different, essentially, algorithms in order to do it, to try and verify we're getting the same answer. Because you can't really go back and look at how it's training. So what you do is you use 3 different methods and hope that it comes to the same conclusion. And that's how we verify it. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Garth. Excellent talk. How do you think and talk about the inherent conflict that arises between land use when it comes to needing to protect our species and massive renewable energy development projects that we see happening in our grasslands, but also across the U.S. How do you think about balancing that and the conflict and needing to protect species?
I think it's a very complicated issue. But, it's a little simpler if you think about agriculture and, say, ranching. So, because diversity within a ranch environment or an agricultural environment can actually improve production within those environments. So it's pretty easy to convince, ranchers to maintain their land in a different way to promote that diversity, which actually increases production within cattle. Similar from an agricultural perspective, sort of a no-till policy and other things can actually promote diversity and increase crop production. When it comes to energy, I think it's a harder one to actually sell because it is overused. I mean, you're using that land and it's just human occupancy and movement across the landscape that also is disrupting those biological, processes as well. But I don't think you can find a solution where you're going to be successful in conservation without reaching out to those partners. There's just no way that that's going to be successful. It's not going to work. Do I know the best way to do it? No, I don't. But I think without trying to find common ground, you're never going to make any headway.
We have time for a few more questions. We have one back here.
To kind of piggyback off that last question and what you were just talking about, what do you see as some of the big steps as far as conserving this species as a whole? Is that something even, for example, citizen scientists can be involved with, the public? How would you go about it?
For this species, I think it's human disturbance in high elevation environments. I know we all love to hike, and I know we love to get up there, but for this species especially, and it can be something as simple as using, well-worn trails and making sure everything you pack in comes out with you. It's as simple as that within their environment. What they don't like are, sadly, yes, I was in their environment in order to study them, but I don't think that is going to help them in the future if people are in that environment manipulating it. So, use worn trails, absolutely. Don't go off trail at all. Keep your dogs at home. Those sorts of things are the most important for these species that are not used to human disturbance, are not used to interactions with us. It's best to let wild things be wild.
I'm coming, Casey. We don't want me to throw it, really.
God. I'm curious about a relationship between the food resources for the birds as well and that dynamic with climate change. I don't know about the world of insects, so I'm not even looking at Frank, but I know there is a huge die-off, and that I'm wondering if that's connected to the reduced, both the reduced populations and the needs to change that in order.
So for this species, it's the insect apocalypse is very important as well. When we're not up there providing oilseed for them in order to get them in our traps, their main food resource is insects that are blown onto snowfields in the summer. And so you need two things in that equation. You need to maintain summer snowfields, which are getting smaller, and you need a healthy insect population so that's coming up, emerging from the lakes and being blown onto those snowfields. Should both of those things go, there are options for this species because they also are granivorous, so they do eat seed at high elevation. So as plants actually move up in elevation because of climate change, it could be a supplemental resource for them, but that's a hypothesis to be tested.
Any other questions?
Were you seeing more significant maintenance or population growth in the subsets where you found more genetic variation? And if so, how significant were those population differences? You may have already answered this question, I may have missed it. But.
No, so so what we can show with our data is that those populations that are connected by high elevation, so generally have what are higher genetic diversity than those that are on the outside. So we can say that those have larger population sizes consistently over time. Outside of that, we can't say that much. So we think those populations are healthier because they have more genetic diversity and variation. And those were the ones that were in those two little pockets. They're connected by high elevation and they're adapted for future climate potential. But outside of that, we can't say too much more.
Thank you.
Any other questions? So before we thank Garth, I wanted to remind people, one of our colleagues, Maiko, is leaving, and there's a party for her up in Harry T. So if you have time, run up there after the lecture, after today's lecture. And no other questions. Let's thank Garth one more time.
And thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it.